Hey, Samuel. Welcome back to Talk Python to me.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me again. So soon after last time.
Yeah, it's always amazing to have you on. In fact, you were on just last week in a really cool show that tons of people enjoyed and is not yet out at the time of recording, but will be released to the world by the time your show goes out live. So it's a bit of a time travel thing, very, very appropriate here. But it was under the full-time open source developers panel of like a bunch of folks. For example, Charlie Marsh, Will McGugan, Gina Hauska, and so on, right? And you snuck in for a minute there in on your travels, but now you're back and we're here to talk properly about something really excellent that you put together called FastUI, which is gonna be a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And yeah, I'm in a slightly better environment for a podcast than the stairwell of a restaurant somewhere in Istanbul. So yeah, it's nice to be back.
High marks for effort there. Come on, that was great.
It was it was good fun, but it was this is a better place to talk about these things.
Yeah, well, I hope you had a good trip and you're back in at it. Kim out in the audience points out, hey, could you just write another impressive tool for the next week's show? Because things are going pretty prolifically over there. You tell people a bit about Pydantic, the company. They probably heard of the library, but just what are you up to these days?
Yeah, so Pydantic's obviously been around since 2017 originally, but then it's like something weird happened at the beginning of 2021. I don't know quite what that was, but like Pydantic, like the downloads just like went crazy. So we were at like 5 million downloads then, and we're now at 130 million. So like it's gone crazy. And then just a bit more than a year ago, I was very lucky. Sequoia got in touch with me and basically said that I want to start a company. I had been meaning to do that after I released Pydantic V2 that I was then working on. But I started the company beginning of this year and now have an amazing team of 10 people working with me. So we released Pydantic V2 finally, having originally told people it would take me alone 3 months. It took me and I guess then 6 people a year in total, but that was released back in the summer. And now we're working on a platform that I'm not going to talk about now, but I would love it if you'd have me back. I guess beginning of
Q2. Is that next week or whatever? Yeah.
It's not quite next week.
Q2 2024, something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we're going to try and get to open beta and in Q1. So yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. Well.
But off the back of that, without getting into lots of details on it, has a platform component to it, and so we have people will be logging in, etc. And I was just thinking about all of the faff and the churn of building the relatively mechanical bits of an application again. It doesn't matter actually if you're building it with React or with one of the other front-end frameworks. You end up having a whole bunch of stuff that's duplicated between what the front-end guys are doing and what the full-stack developers or the back-end developers are building. For us, and I guess for lots of people, there's a Pydantic model that's kind of at the core of lots of those bits. And I was just dreading all of that churn. And I had been wanting to build something like FastUI for a long time, but the fact that we're going to be using it internally really spurred me on to go and get it built and release it in like a very incomplete phase to see what people thought. And yeah, there's been a great reaction, and here I am.
Yeah, there has been quite the reaction to it. Let's see. Do the GitHub star test. It's 2.6 thousand stars, and it's what, 2 weeks old?
Yeah,
a month old. Yeah, a month old. Last month, anyway.
Well, it was only released publicly, like 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks ago. I think.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, you worked on it a little bit private, and then you flipped the bit on the public status. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because you don't want people just to go, "Whoa, what are they building?" I mean, maybe you do. Maybe like, what is this GitHub repo? They misspelled Fast API. I don't know what they're working on.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I mean, we have a team with lots of people who've done lots of open source, very strongly opinionated engineers. I can't even get my team to use it without kind of proving the value in it. So I worked on it a bit without really talking to them, and then was like, right, I built this thing. Let's at least give it a try. Because I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong in this, but I think it's quite a fundamentally different way of thinking about how you build user interfaces from lots of the tools that exist today in the Python ecosystem. And so there's a bit of a like education piece and trying to understand the principle as well as the like mechanics of going and using it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to dive into the philosophy, but I'll give people the too long didn't read version. The basically you can create UIs in pure Python in sort of dynamic web framework friendly ways, right?
Yeah. So that's the thing that I think, and maybe I think that probably the mistake is in my description of it, because yes, it does that, but where I personally think FastUI is powerful and where we're using it within the Pydantic team is actually, we have got front-end developers. We've got some really expert guys like who are very comfortable building stuff in React, but
right.
we don't want those two roles to have to constantly communicate to build every individual bit. So the idea is, I think if you go down the page a little bit, I kind of explain it, but like for a Python developer, it's this way of building UIs without having to touch TypeScript or JavaScript or NPM or any of those Byzantine like mess of build tools. But then for a front-end developer, it's this opportunity to go and build the best components you can and allow basically provide a powerful interface for your back-end guys to go and build a UI with it. To kind of split those two things up and I guess allow React to do what React does brilliantly, which is provide these like reusable components.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of a framework as well to bring the navigation and the cohesion of the whole app together, not just a particular view or a page too, you would say, right?
Yeah. So the weird bit is this principle of RESTful interfaces. We've all heard of REST or RESTful, and we all think we know what it means, which is basically something to do with a URL structure and return me some JSON that like gives me the data I need to render my view. Well, if you look at the Roy Fielding's original PhD, as is brilliantly described in this HTMX article that I talk about further on down here, he's not really talking about that stuff. Sure, he has some stuff on what the URL structure should be, but really his principle is that the data returned from the backend should be self-describing, as in it should have everything you need to go and render the user interface. So let's say, I think they're using the HTMX example, the example of like a bank account. And if you go down to like principle, the long version, here we are, right? I've linked to the PhD, but more importantly, the HTMX article, which explains it really well. So I think if we follow that, yeah, I think they'll even on that page, there's a very jokey tone lots of the time, HTMX, but they also talk about some really cool things.
Yeah,
so somewhere I think they have, yeah, here we are, right? So if you look at the traditional JSON response, which I think is the second one, and you were trying to show, yeah, right. So this, you and I as humans can read this and be like, yeah, that kind of explains my bank account and what's going on. But there is not enough.
Right. It's got like an account number and a balance, which is a more complicated object, nested object, and those types of things.
Right. It's got all the things, and we can read account number. Cool, that's a number. Balance, yeah, that makes sense. But if your computer, there's not enough there to go and render someone the nice user interface they would want, where they would have it displayed on a page. So if you were the engineering team in the bank trying to turn this into a web interface, you then need to go and have lots of very application-specific or page-specific logic to show where the account number goes and where the balance goes and where the status goes and stuff like that. Right. And that causes enormous amounts of churn, and it means that it's particularly difficult for when you have those engineers working in different time zones, because you end up having this spec between the two. And then you always have this problem with software where, fine, we can get it to work, but what happens when we come to add it? So what's the process of, let's say we want to show as well on this page your like joint account balance, let's say, just to make something up. What we probably need to do is we need to get the backend guys to go and add that to the endpoint, and then the front end, and that can be deployed, and then the front end can be updated to show that, and the data is available. That is lots of churn, lots of delay in that. So the principle,
right. Lots of coordination between the two domain experts, and then it kind of, you got that microservice cascading, like it's got to do this, then this one's got to be upgraded, and then eventually there's enough flow of data through the system that the UI people can put it up there, right?
Right. And so,
Okay.
and it's bad in this case of like showing your bank balance, but it gets even worse when you have a form where every field in the form needs to be completed, for example. And so we basically have to deploy the front end that has all of the form components and the back end that receives that new form at the same time. And we've got this Pydantic model that, if we, depending on how we've done it, probably is used to define our form, and it might even be used to define our database. But like, we're not using a Pydantic model in the front end. TypeScript, in my opinion's big Achilles heel in typing is that you can't use type ins at runtime, and so we don't have an equivalent of Pydantic, and so we're basically trusting that data is how it is. And so yeah, FastAPI is an attempt. Sorry, FastUI is an attempt to basically remove that need to like have complete synchronization between backend and front end by having beautifully designed components in the front end. I'm not saying what we have now is that beautiful, but that's the idea long term. But then the back end can basically can do the orchestration, can say, show me a table, show me a form, show me a modal, and put the following content in it, etc.
Excellent. Nice comment from Tony out the audience. Says, I originally started in Python, went to using TypeScript. Pydantic made the transition back to Python so nice. And so in your description, you also have up here that this Pydantic is involved here. Like, what is the role that Pydantic plays?
Right. So the idea is that we're getting to of this RESTful UI is really that we end up having a bunch of components in like a shared definition of some components, and we basically promise that the backend is going to send data that matches the types defined in the front end. Well, that's all very well, but if you're not careful, you end up not sending quite the right data. So what's nice is that all of the components that you can return from FastUI are themselves Pydantic models. And so Pydantic goes off and does not only the validation, but also the coercion, and it does stuff like uses camel case so that front-end developers are happy because we've got no underscores anywhere. And so yeah, all of the front end, the back-end code for FastUI is basically is just Pydantic models, which implement these these components, right? So it might be useful for those who can see this to go in, and I can talk through an example. If we go into the code here, and I can talk you through like a very basic component. Maybe it'd be easiest if I showed it here. So I've got the code base open here. I'm just working on something, but if I open up here, source, and then the Python package, and then we look into components, and we can look at like a really simple component, probably is button, which would be a kind of understandable to everyone. Where's button? Here we are. So this is just a plain Pydantic model, which contains text, which is the text you would put within the button. Then it contains the event that you want to fire when someone clicks on it, and HTML type, which in this matches what you can get in HTML. Button, reset, submit, and then class name, which becomes the classes that get applied, and then critically this type, which is a literal, which has to be button, and that is used by the discriminated union in Pydantic to do the validation of different types, and it's also used by a big switch statement in the TypeScript to basically decide what component I'll go and render when I get back an object,
right.
when I get an object.
Right. So there's some TypeScript. Maybe it makes sense to talk a bit about the building blocks. So you say FastUI is made up of 4 things, just so people can get a sense of like, what's at play here.
Right. So the 4 things that we have now are a PyPy package, a Python package called FastUI, which I was just showing you there the types for.
Yep.
And then we have a NPM package called FastUI again. It's in the Pydantic organization, which is where the meat of the logic resides, and that's implementing basically the most of the components and all of the wiring to mean that when I return the button component gets rendered. And then, but obviously, we don't probably want to end up using a vanilla button when we come to display it. So then I've implemented basically customization of the FastUI React library using Bootstrap. So all that's really doing is it's deciding what classes to append to use with each component, and also just customizing a few of them. So for example, modal, there's no like nice way to do a vanilla modal. So the modal implementation in the default FastUI npm package just basically shows me alerts saying this isn't implemented, whereas the Bootstrap one uses a nice Bootstrap modal. And then we have finally FastUI pre-built, which basically uses the FastUI package, customizes it with FastUI Bootstrap, and then builds it. And that means we can go and basically return that pre-built React app without having to get our hands dirty with npm on Yarn and Vite and all the other
all the webpacky bundling, minifying, transpiling business.
But the cool bit, in my opinion, of FastUI is that at its core, it's really the definition of a bunch of different schemas, effectively. Those schemas are defined in Pydantic and they're defined in TypeScript, but they could perfectly well be, and really nicely, I just merged this the other day, we now use the JSON schema generated by Pydantic and JSON schema generated by the React types to basically go and test that there's an equivalence between those models everywhere. But in theory, there's nothing to stop the front end from being built with another JavaScript library, or even with something like HTML and HTMX, or even you could go and use React Native and build, or even some kind of embedded device. You could go and implement those components. And then on the other side, and this is even more achievable, you could go and return data that matches those models from a Rust or Go service, and in theory not have to change your UI at all, because all you're doing is I promise that I'm going to match these schemas, and then whatever front end and whatever back end can then communicate. Whether that comes to pass, I don't know yet. And obviously I built the default back end in Python because that's what I know best and where I think Pydantic's really helpful. And I built the first front end in React and TypeScript because one, that's what I know, and two, it's what we're using within Pydantic. But lots of people have asked about HTMX. People have also asked about Svelte and others. I think I wouldn't see the point in building like FastUI in Vue because I don't think it adds much. It's just a lot of work.
Right.
But I think there's a world where we build a HTMX template rendered version of FastUI's front end that could be super valuable.
That's interesting. So first point is these different components sound like they are potentially a little mix and match. You know, you could take it all as one big thing, or you could say, really like the way it defines the React front end, but we're going to implement it some other endpoint.
Yeah, I think it's something like it'll be slightly skewed now because of tests, but I'd say it's sort of twice as much front end to back end at the moment, as in it's skewed a bit by tests, but even now there's more TypeScript. So I think the simplest thing to do, and you could do it pretty trivially, would be to use another backend, another language for your backend service. And as long as it matches those types, and you could even go and use something like JSON schema to enforce that. The re-implementing the front end, probably a bigger piece of work, but totally doable. I mean, I did it in my spare time in 2 weeks, built the whole thing. So it's not, millions of different things. There's kind of 20 components at the moment that are then composable to build reasonably sophisticated like UIs.
So this is a web front end like Flask or Django sort of framework, but a way that really incorporates building the UI in Python and validating and enforcing that with Pydantic, rather than just, hey, file new HTML, let's just start typing and hope they line up. Instead of trying to juggle all those different languages, CSS, HTML, all the JavaScript tooling for packing up stuff, just let's write Python, right? So maybe you got a simple example of what it looks like to define a real simple example here on the README. It's got a very interesting parity between what is in the HTML DOM and is what is in the Python abstract syntax tree, I guess, right? And visually as well, the way you look at the code, it looks like the way it might look in HTML. Like, give us a sense of what writing a UI in this would look like.
Right. So I think first of all, we have to talk about like the two most obvious pitfalls for this. One end of the pitfall you have, which I think is the biggest temptation, is to basically mirror all of HTML in Python. And for those of us who are happy writing HTML or writing React, that sounds like hell. It's going to be slow because you have to do some weird rendering, but it's also just going to be a pig because I don't want to have to define every href and everything else in Python code. And there are going to be, it requires, for a start, it requires you to know two things, Python and HTML, whereas to write HTML, you only need to know one.
I always find these things that try to dodge the fact that HTML exists. I find them, I don't know, they don't resonate with me. I'm not entirely sure why. It's like we have really nice things like CSS, and we have really, there's just so much tooling and frameworks. You know, you mentioned Bootstrap already, right? That just plug into there. And if it's like, well, we're just going to recreate it in Python. Well, it has all the oddities of HTML if it's going to be really high parity. And then you just have a less well-known way to do the same weird thing. You know, I don't know. It doesn't resonate super with me.
I agree. And I found the same thing at times with ORMs, that you end up, the worst case of an ORM is you work out what you need to do in SQL, then you try and translate back from SQL to ORM, and it would be much nicer just to write MySQL. I mean, not always the case. ORMs can be powerful, but I think that they both can fall into the same trap if you're not careful. And then I was going to say, at the far end of the spectrum, the other end of the spectrum, you have, and I guess Django's admin view, for understandable reasons, could suffer from this, that you basically have a very small set of things. You have a table page and a details page and a form page, and that's kind of it, right? So there's this difficult trade-off in where in that continuum do we try to choose what size of component to implement, right? So for example, here we have a heading, which is almost one-for-one matches what you would do in HTML. We have the text that goes within it, and we have the level, which, you know, it's slightly different syntax, but it's basically one-for-one matching an HTML tag. But then we have a table, which it doesn't look very much like an HTML table at all. We're not having to explicitly define the table body versus the table head. We're not having to put in each column. We're not having to worry. There's lots of stuff here that is much less like it. And that's where it's in these very common components where there is consistent things that lots of people want to do, or lots of places in your app where you might want to do them, where I think a framework like FastUI gets super powerful, because we can get you a table here with users defined and with a few columns with some customization on what happens how we render each column much more quickly than we could go write out all the HTML for that. And it's much more concise to read. It's consistent enough that something like GitHub Copilot will help you write it out where you do have a bit of customization to do. I think this is where it can be super powerful.
It is pretty interesting, and I like the hierarchy. For people listening, just check out github.com/pydantic/fastui, the example right there on the page. But what you do is you create in this case, a fast API endpoint, and then you return a hierarchy of elements out of FastUI. So we have a page. The page has components. The components are a list of a header and a table. The table has data, which maps over to a list of Pydantic models, which then help say what goes in the field and for the column headings and things like that. It's pretty interesting. I think it's neat.
Thank you. And obviously we can add other components like pagination that works. I think just to come back to the top to how we do these views, the very simple, and it's most simple, what FastUI's React app does is it basically takes whatever the URL is you go to. So in this case, you might go to the base URL, and it prepends /API and makes a request to that endpoint to basically say, what should I render? And it gets back. So this here we're basically returning a list of Pydantic models. All that the FastUI model is really doing is taking that list of Pydantic models and calling model dump JSON on it to get the JSON that we return to the front end. As I say, the front end then knows how to render each of those. Each dictionary in the list is what it is at its core. At its core, it's a list of objects to use JavaScript parlance, and it just knows how to render each of them, and it renders each of them in turn. And then obviously they can then have nested other models, all of which it knows how to render.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of a couple of things. I have an example. Is this somewhere along here? I pulled it up. It reminds me of kind of what React looks like. If people have done React, you write a function that returns kind of an HTML thing, but then it has JavaScript arrow functions, right? But it has the same nested feel, right? Did React inspire you to create it this way, or not really?
Yeah, it did. I've done quite a lot of React, and I like it a lot. I know there are, as a popular piece of technology, there are lots of people who like to berate it, but I do think React's been a powerful step forward. And the greatest form of flattery is copying, and there are enough other there are other more powerful, arguably more performant new front end libraries, but everything is component based now. React just changed the sea change in how we did front end with their component architecture, and JSX similarly is super powerful.
So one of the things that I think we're going to get to, I don't want to dive into it yet, but in React, you would say we're going to return a photo context or a switch or something that is not typically known in HTML. And these are higher order building blocks in the UI space, right? So when people think about what they're creating here in Python, it's not just the fundamental DOM objects and elements, is it?
Right. So that's exactly, yeah. So page here, there's a bit of ambiguity about how we're going to define a page. Default implementation does something reasonably sensible. It pads it, etc. But heading there isn't much to do really. You're going to return a heading, but when you come to a table, there's a lot of debate about how you're going to do that. And then when you move on to even higher order components like a modal, then that's the how exactly that's implemented is it's in some sense it's completely the choice of how you've implemented it in the front end. You could do lots of different things, but yeah, the whole point is that it doesn't and shouldn't be each HTML tag is written out, because as I say, I think that would be a obvious failure mode for this.
Yeah. The other thing this reminds me of, by the way, just for people out there listening, is that it looks a lot like a Flutter. If people have done any Flutter, you've got these widget hierarchies. You build them, you maybe set some properties, you add in a bunch of elements, set some children to an array of other sub elements. And this is done, of course, in Dart, but it's this is kind of a Python version that's similar as well, these higher order widgets.
Yeah, absolutely. Similar thing. And actually, the other place where I've built this before is that internally Pydantic core, the Rust bit of Pydantic, is effectively not entirely different to this, right? You define these nested structures of different validators. Everything at its core is a combined validator, which is in Rust terms an enormous enum of all the different types of validator, some of which have nested within them more and more validators. And that's how you build up nested structures of Pydantic models, which in turn is what these are. We're getting a bit.
Yeah, the validators and the UI, they kind of have a similar structure. Bit of a sidebar, just a bit of a piece of code in here. You've got table, which is a class, square bracket, user, which is another class, square bracket. I imagine that you and your team are deeper into the Python type system than the vast majority of others out there, with all the work with Pydantic and the interoperability with Rust. What is that? Tell people about this.
Yeah, so table is the generic. So if you can imagine if you were doing list of ints, you would do list square bracket int. And that's basically the point is that list is a generic around its elements, same as a dict is generic around its keys and its values. Well, table here is generic around the Pydantic model that you're using to using for each row. And particularly what that means is that what it means practically is that table has access to the class when it's deciding what the default columns are. So if you don't define the columns list as we have here to say what columns to display, it'll show all of the fields in the Pydantic model. And the point is we get access to that to user before even if data was empty or before the validation has happened. Is it necessary? Is it slightly like fancy use of Pydantic types, Python types? Maybe it is, but if you know, forgive the Pydantic team or me in particular for occasionally doing fancy things with Python types. That is definitely occupational hazard of what we do.
I didn't mean it as a negative. I just thought it was interesting.
No, I agree, and actually I had it somewhere else on forms and I removed it and realized it was unnecessary. So you can definitely do such a thing as too much Python typing.
Yeah, for sure. Though it is pretty interesting. So let's maybe talk about some of the examples. Actually, before we do, just give us a sense of where does this fit in the UI space for Python. On one hand, we've got Flask, Django, Fast API returning HTML, etc., where it's all on you, right? You're doing all the 5 languages of web apps, SQL or some query language, Python, JavaScript, CSS, some other tools, right? Like you're doing all that and you're doing it by hand. On the other end, we've got tools that are pretty cool. Like we've got Anvil that lets you just write Python and do a draggy droppy sort of thing, which is really neat, but it fits into kind of a box for those types of apps. I just discovered Dropbase. Have you heard of Dropbase?
I've not seen Dropbase. But I've seen a lot of these like get me a UI more quickly.
A lot of them are like kind of low code. Anvil, maybe I wouldn't really quite put it there, but they're pretty like low code. But then there's places where Python goes to make it dynamic, right? So where in that spectrum would you put FastUI as it is today?
So interestingly, and one of the reasons I wanted to come and talk to you was I heard you were talking the other day on your other podcast, and I heard you talking about FastUI and kind of, I'd say, categorizing it into that group. And one of the things I wanted to come and say was, yes, we can do that, but the use case we have within Pydantic is actually to go and build a pretty complex, fully fledged application with front end developers building components, but just get rid of that churn.
Right. Something more like Gmail, less like here's a table that I can click on and see some related table.
Right, exactly. And what I should probably have put in the demo, and probably where Pydantic is people most associate it and where this is going to be most useful, is within forms. So I don't know if you want to go to the demo and I can talk people through, but like a lot of the logic within FastUI is dedicated to forms. We can do things like nested Pydantic models all become components within a form. And obviously we can do client-side validation with a whole bunch of stuff, and we can also do server-side validation. But then we get all the fancy stuff like if the data is invalid and you get a validation error on the server side, we'll then basically re-render the form with the errors in place. All that stuff that like anyone building a web application has to go and implement some version of it. At the moment, there are some React libraries that will build you a form from JSON schema, but they don't perfectly fit in with what Pydantic does or with Fast API. And so I have built some variant of that about 5 times. I still think the state of the art until now is Django, but like lots of us don't want to build our web applications completely with Django because it's pretty all or nothing, despite the wonder that is Django. And so that's the kind of space where for me this like becomes really stands out, because what would have been to do it properly, it's days of work to get form submission to work, get client-side validation, server-side validation, get the redirect after your form. None of that stuff is entirely trivial, even for those of us who've done it before. Whereas with the theory is with FastUI, and although FastUI does not require Fast API, the form stuff is quite tightly integrated with Fast API, and you can get a really good experience of building stuff like forms. I think that where the alternative really today is to use, no disrespect to any of the Flask libraries or any of the other things, but I think the only real alternative right now is implement it yourself or use Django.
Okay, interesting. But I do want to go to the demo, and I want to talk about, but I do also want to, but maybe before we get to that, let's try to take a little survey of what are these widgets, these building blocks that you can use. Yeah, is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I can find them here. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you got a FastUI demo, which I'll link to at onrender.com with a prefix. Yeah. But you talk about some of the things that you can just create in that Python hierarchy that you return that builds up your UI there.
Yeah.
So maybe we talk us through some of the things that are here.
Yes. So we have the kind of generic markdown component, which will go off and renders the markdown. This table itself is implemented using the markdown component. Just one side note: the markdown and the code, because they have quite a lot of JavaScript associated with them, and they're actually lazily loaded to make the pre-built FastUI app faster to load. Then we have text, probably the simplest one of all, just render some text. Paragraph, again, very simple. Page titles, a slightly funny one. It doesn't actually display anything on the page, but it changes the browser title, so what you see in the tab at the top of the page.
Right. It's not always easy to do. Like, how do you inject it into the head when you're in the body? And like, it right. takes a little bit of integration there. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Heading, again, very simple, like 1 to 6 HTML heading. Code, bit more sophisticated. And if you click on code, maybe those who can see it will be able to click through. Oh, code is so code is there. We get a like highlighted bit of source code displayed.
Mm-hmm. It's color coded with like class types having a color and keywords having a color. That's nice.
Like you would see in GitHub or something like that. So again, that should just like work out the box. Then we have some components like link list and link, which are used in other components mostly. So if the nav bar you see at the top of the page there, that uses a link list, and then we have links. And then we get into kind of more sophisticated components. So the first one, you see a button which loads a modal. And then the button which loads a dynamic modal. So when the modal loads, it will make a request to get the content you want to see within that modal. So that could be a form, or it could be customized depending on the form in the page. Then we have loading content from the server, which is the same thing we were doing in the modal, but on the page. Then we have this SSE component. So again, very simple to use within FastUI, but like quite a lot of work to use server-side events to basically dynamically update a React component if you weren't using that.
Yeah. So your server load SSE widget.
Yeah.
That provides, like you said, server sent events, which I don't know how many people are familiar with SSE. I'm sure they're familiar with WebSockets, and they're familiar with just like a JavaScript event, but this is like an intermediate sort of lightweight, one directional, but normally the opposite in reverse, I guess, from the server to the client, sort of pushing out stuff, right? So that's a really powerful thing. And if it's that easy to just hook a function call when something happens, that's pretty cool.
One of the things I want to try with SSE that I think will work really nicely is LLM responses, where you get like one token at a time because you don't want to wait for the whole thing.
Yeah.
Server sent events would be perfect for basically printing out the response from an LLM. And again, it would be like 2 lines of code to add that to an app with FastUI. It would not be 2 lines of code to go and implement that yourself, whether you're using pure JavaScript or React or whatever framework. Then we have iframe, which again we're back to kind of mapping one-to-one to a component. One of the nice things to say about both iframe and image is they were contributed by other people. So I don't think I'd even created an issue asking for them, but people have come along and added them. It's been one of the nice things to see. I think we had 18 or so people contribute to the first release after my initial release, the second release of FastUI. So good engagement from lots of people. Image.
So you've got a bunch of UI stuff here, and it just, as I look at this and I see what you're building, it just makes me think of like, wow, there's an opportunity for stuff like what you get out, not necessarily the same as, but like what you get out of, say, Tailwind UI, where the things you might work with are, on-off switches, like toggles, like you might see in your phone, or other sort of elements that have like a lot of design imbued in them that people can just grab and use, almost like a Django philosophy for the front end in a sense. There is that something that you are dreaming of? Or
definitely. And I think I haven't, someone was complaining somewhere that we didn't have a grid component yet, and I think we'll do one, but like those bits get quite opinionated. But like calendar, completely obvious choice, right? Complete faff to go and implement that yourself in HTML, commonly used, trivial to define because the definition, there aren't that many different things to define. You choose your month, most of us are on the Gregorian calendar, right? We're not going to have to change too much what calendar we're going to render. So that's a perfect example of the kind of thing. Tiles like this, again, totally possible to go and implement them. And again, obviously we can provide some nice default, but also if you're a bigger company and you want to go and customize it, you can totally do that. And you can have a front-end developer go through and implement the classes that basically customize the look. But I wanted to come back just and show you some of the some of the other components. So we were on
this one
here. I don't know if we have anything more below that, but I would love to show you the tables, because the tables and the forms are really where it comes into. So cities is probably the best example.
Cities are the one. Okay, yeah, awesome.
So this is a list of cities just for some public data set with country and population. But at the top, you see we have a filter to choose by country. And if we click here, if you start searching like UN or something, you'll see we're doing a server side. We're loading from the server the list of cities. So again, this component to go and implement, if you were going to do that from scratch, you've got to use some like clever. This is a list of countries. So if you do like
countries, sorry, I'm typing in cities.
If you did like UN, you'll get United Kingdom and United States.
Yeah. Perfect. There you go.
Right, and then we do United States or whatever. And then we'll get a bunch of cities in the United States. Building this and wiring it all up and using we use React Select here, but you can use Select 2 or one of those components. It's not trivial. You need to also set up the back end. You need to set up, there's like a few hundred lines of React dedicated just to setting up those selects correctly. And as you'll see in a minute on a form, you can add this to a form with FastUI pretty trivially. Secondly, if you go to the bottom of the page on cities, you'll see pagination. Again, not a trivial thing to go and set up. If you've got, if you're just starting from scratch and you want to show build an internal endpoint, for example, to show all of your users, doing all that pagination and like wiring all that up is not trivial, but we effectively do the work for you to have that component and do the maths of which page we're on and stuff like that.
Nice.
Again, I want to reiterate, that FastUI is not just designed as a kind of Django admin interface alternative. We within Pydantic are going to go and use it for UI that we're going to show to end users. But obviously, it also comes into its own when people want to just get something up quickly.
If we have a design language or something like that, or even using a framework, I mean, you mentioned Bootstrap, but Tailwind or Bulva, is that one of the new ones? Like, if we're working with one of those and we wanted to use this, like, how easy is it to sort of bring in those elements there?
So if I show you here on so I'll show you how we customize it with Bootstrap, which is probably the best definition of it. So you'll see here, this is the where am I looking? This is the pre-built version. So this is obviously the pre-built version of FastUI you can get, but it's actually it's a very simple app in terms of React. This app has two components. It has a div which contains the FastUI component, and then we customize it in a bunch of ways. We have a component that we render for not found. We have a component we render for spinner and for transitioning. But then these are the two that really matter, where we can customize the classes and we can customize how we render certain components. So if we come in here to have this function from Bootstrap, which is how we customize the classes, you'll see that at its core, it's just this big old switch. So this is all TypeScript, type safe, because types are very powerful in TypeScript, but all of the props will have this type key, as I showed you earlier when we were looking at the Python code.
That's like the button and all the different things, yeah.
Based on the switch, we just go through, and this is all just defining the classes we want for all of the different components, some of them depending on the exact state of the component. So all of these form inputs, we customize them depending on which type they are and on which mode we're in, et cetera, et cetera. But it's all very mechanical, just laying out the classes we need for each individual case. And then we have the other way of customizing it, which is to use custom components. We basically, for three in particular components, navbar, modal, and pagination, we define our own custom React component. So here's the one for navbar, where we use a bunch of Bootstrap types to render a Bootstrap navbar. But
you could basically create a React component that has all the settings necessary to create a nav bar in Tailwind or whatever, right?
Right.
And then
so if you
plug
wanted
that
to use
stuff in.
Tailwind, what's this? Like 20, it's like 100 lines of code to define all of the classes. And it's pretty mechanical code, right? So it wouldn't be hard at all to go and use Tailwind CSS. And then you might want to define a few of your components specifically. But actually, modal, I think, is the only one that really requires it to be custom implemented, because the default just shows you an alert, because there's nothing
right.
into a
JavaScript.
modal.
The page says, it's like, no, the page doesn't say, this isn't going to work.
Yeah. So I think this is one of the bits I'm most proud of here, is that like how much you could customize it and how simply you could start to customize it.
Right. It's really like kind of pluggable or extensible, so you don't have to, get in and know too much about it. You just plug in the class name generator and the renderer for
exactly
one.
And so and all of the types it's all type scripted, so the types should do a lot of help telling you what you can implement. Last thing I'll show you is so here in the default build, as I said, our custom render function is not just a Bootstrap one. We do one special thing, which is where we have this idea of a custom component, which basically all it has is a subtype, which basically you should use to render it however you like. So in our case, we take custom, and if the subtype is cowsay, we render that as a particular block, like use this component here, and we print out the cow says whatever it was that the input was from the server. And otherwise, we just go back to using the Bootstrap render. And so if you look at that component here, we've got this like slightly silly example of a custom component of cowsay saying something.
Oh, that's fun.
But it shouldn't be too difficult to customize. And then even if you're customizing, to go back to using Bootstrap for the fallback case of everything else.
Okay, so you could almost, just for one section that has to be really specialized, do something custom, but otherwise just lean on a framework.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this looks like something that one person could take one for the team, create a Tailwind or a whatever generator, class name generator, and then put that as either a contribution or put it up on GitHub, and then you're kind of good to go.
Yeah, I think we might actually do it. We're using Tailwind and Radix within Pydantic, so I suspect our front end guys will at some point get annoyed with my use of Bootstrap and go off and go and change it. One of the reasons I use Bootstrap is that because Bootstrap is completely customized via SCSS, and there's SCSS compilers for Python, we have at least the possibility in future to allow you to customize the complete look and feel of your app without ever having to touch NPM, because you just go change basically the color definitions as we do here. So the default version of maybe I can even change it here, and as it's running, it'll change. But if here you see I've set the primary color to be black, and so you'll see the buttons here are all rendered as black. If I were to change it, I haven't tried this for a bit, so I hope it works. If I commented out primary, you'll see that all of the
changed to blue.
They've all changed
to primary, which is the Bootstrap primary button dash.
And if I changed if I got rid of the default font, you would see we went back to whatever the other font was. So there's a world in future where we allow you to customize the look and feel even within Bootstrap from Python code.
Yeah, tell people maybe who don't know what SCSS is. They probably know what CSS is.
So it's generally referred to as SAS, which is SASS, which is basically a more powerful version of CSS where you can
SAS and less. Those were the two.
Yeah, there was SAS and less, and then we kind of settled on SAS, but then we had SCSS, which is SAS with more CSS-y syntax. It's a way to like do slightly more powerful things in CSS and minify it and have stuff like variables before they were available in CSS and defaults, and even you can do weird stuff like map functions, and they're used very heavily in Bootstrap. But the nice bit is because the compiler is written in C, there's libsass in Python where you can get kind of a front-end customization without needing the whole of Node and the whole dog and pony show of front-end development.
Yeah, excellent. All right, well, I think it's got a lot of legs. So when I saw this, and I saw, okay, this is for web apps, and it's kind of got this Python code running that defines the backend, and it's got the UI, and it's all a little self-contained. One of the thoughts I had was, wouldn't it be neat if there was a little bundler type of thing that made this into an Electron app? Would this be possible? Could we get something that you could send out, or is this really just going to be intended to be, kind of a friend of Django type of thing?
I have not used Electron for a very long time, so I don't pretend to be an expert. What I will say is that unlike some of the other UI libraries, we're not trying to do clever things with WebSockets and do all of the rendering requiring duplex communication between the client and the server. It's pretty simple. It's like make a request and the JSON contains some information about how to render it, and then the front end goes off and renders it. So it's the result, what you get when you finish, is very, in terms of from a networking point of view, very simple, very conventional. It's like make an HTTP request, get back JSON, JavaScript knows how to render it. And so I don't see why it shouldn't work in Electron. There's even the world in which we don't need the whole of Electron, and someone could go and build FastUI components for whatever native library, and we could get like native apps running that are based on FastUI. Not saying that's necessarily a good idea, but like those possibilities exist.
It does exist. Okay. Yeah. Very interesting. Another thing that is a convention, I suppose, I'll see if I can pull it out here, is the UI. A lot of times you'll have either just / you'll have / users, but then you'll have an API that backs it. And there's this convention that if it's in the URL, if you have /API / in this example we were talking about before, it's like /table /cities. If you say API /table / that's the data endpoint. And then if you drop the API, that's the front end that then turns around and calls the back end with the API inserted, right? You want to talk about that convention a little bit so people kind of see where that's going?
Yeah, so that's how I've set it up in the default app. You don't have to do it like that. And I think we're using a separate subdomain to avoid like path-based routing and all that fun. But yeah, the principle, the default simplest way of basically doing a calculation to go from I've got a URL, how do I get the data for it, is, as I said earlier, basically prepend /API.
So maybe a more general way to think about it is for every page, there is an endpoint that is a fast API endpoint, or a pair of them, maybe even. One returns the HTML front end stuff that makes it run,
so
that then talks around and goes back to itself, right?
Yeah, so what we have in the default app here, and what I would generally recommend is, where are we? We have a bunch of routers that connect and do all of the API stuff, and I've just been implementing Auth, which I can show you in a minute, but that's not available. There's a PR for it, but it's not available in the demo you're looking at. Like basically catch-all endpoint, which if nothing else has been hit, will render the standard HTML. And one of the nice things is that the Python library gives you this pre-built HTML, which will basically render you the HTML that you'll get if I went here and I view page source, you'll see it's just returning. Well, yeah, in this particular, if I went to 8,000, then it wouldn't be messed up by Vite. You just get this very simple HTML, which in turn renders the app. So yeah, there's effectively, you're right. There's a like matching endpoints for every view you might want to have. One to return the JSON, and one to render the HTML. But
you don't write them both, right? You write the API one, and then FastUI magically
or whatever
into UI.
Right, and this would most of this, with the exception of the form submission, would all just work out the box with any Python web framework. You just need to produce your Pydantic model, dump it to JSON, and return that in a response. But one of the really nice things about this being the like actual data existing in JSON is that writing a test, there's quite a lot here, but you'll see most of it is markdown. So writing a test that our views contain what we expect them to is massively easier when we're testing against JSON, which we can convert to Python objects and test, than it would be if we've got an HTML page and we're running a bunch of regexes for, does this page contain the user's name? Does it contain the word logout? Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. By write type of things, or those types of tests. Sure.
Or even worse, you end up with like playwright and like
playwright.
Let's take an image of it and see if the image looks like the image used to look, and things I don't want to have to build. I mean, they have to happen occasionally, but like ironically, we'll probably end up with them in FastUI to like even more certainty that our components work correctly, but hopefully thereby avoid everyone else having to go and build them.
Is there any concern that maybe there's unintended APIs, in the sense that like all of this stuff, I'm sure this is probably true for pretty much any React site, but like a lot of the page is available also as an API, even if you don't intend it to be an API? Like
I think that's a limitation of any. I mean, in some ways the data will be slightly less nice to. Yeah, you're right. If you're a company that give people foreign exchange rates and you want them to always come to your site, you obviously can't render that with React, because there's going to be a JSON endpoint where someone can just go scrape your exchange rates or whatever else it might be.
Right, but you can still do session-based auth and say you have to log in to do it, right? It's not just that it's public. It just there's always a JSON version. But honestly, there's so many interesting ways to pull data out of HTML. Like,
if someone's determined, if it's that valuable, someone will do it anyway. I also think that, like, in theory, if your options are build pure React or do this, then this has the like, as I say, there's the realistic chance someone's going to come along and implement a FastUI front end that renders HTML, and then you don't have to expose those JSON endpoints at all, and you could return HTML from your server. We just haven't got around to building it yet.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I guess you could maybe do some kind of server-side rendering potentially as well.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. Whether it's Python server-side rendering, or whether it's JavaScript server-side rendering, or whether it's edge rendering. I've tried to build a sort of edge rendering thing in Cloudflare years ago using Rust, and for a bunch of reasons it didn't quite work. But there's real possibility of doing like any number of different things in that direction.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, like some of the CDNs have pretty dynamic stuff right at the edge where you can sort of put your last bit of code.
Yeah, I
haven't done anything with that.
That's kind of what Remix is doing, and Next.js to a lesser extent. So, but again, in theory, maybe I'm overblowing it, and FastUI will remain what it is now. But like in theory, we've set up this language of different components that hopefully is, whilst by no means universal, complete enough that you can build lots of common user interfaces with it. And then if it really gains adoption, then people can go and build new backends and new front ends, and they all, in theory, should be able to mix and match with each other. We'll see if that happens.
Yeah. And widgets too, right? Kind of like Tailwind UI created a paid thing for higher order widgets. Potentially just being React already makes that probably exists, and I just don't know.
And there's been a number of issues of people wanting to render existing basically build extensions to FastUI to render their widgets. I think we will probably support the repra HTML that things like Pandas data frames already return, so that you could, for example, return a data frame, and it might not be pretty, but you'll get something coming up as HTML, and start ugly and then move on to doing those things in an even more powerful way.
Sure. Yeah, I didn't even think of the data science side, but there's probably a lot of cool dashboard widgets connected to pandas and polars that are potential out there.
Yeah, and charts and visualizing data is something Pydantic is interested in. There's no reason why a lot of them couldn't be implemented as FastUI components and then displayed.
Yep. Okay. We are running pretty short on time, but I feel like we should probably bring a little more Pydantic to the side. Just talk real quickly about forums, right? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you probably easiest if you share my screen. I'll do it from here because I can also like the forms pretty boring
behind the scenes. Yeah.
It's probably most interesting if we look at the how the form is implemented in the code first, and then we look at what that means for the UI. So this is the login form that Michael, you were just showing here that I can show, which is
so there's a login form with an email address, password, some validation. basically like that. Yeah.
That's powered entirely by, again, a completely vanilla Pydantic model. And the way that we return that is we return three things. Heading, which is just telling the person what we're looking at here in the demo, and then this third thing is the interesting bit where, again, actually the model form is again generic around the Pydantic model, and then it takes one other argument, which is the submit URL, and that's enough information.
So what you're returning as part of that hierarchy in Python is a model form, and you give it a Pydantic model, and so it looks at the Pydantic class and says, we're going to create like an email address and a password field and so on, right?
Exactly that. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay.
And then when you submit that form, it's submitted as form data. So as not as JSON data, but as a vanilla HTML form,
a standard form post type of thing.
Post form, and then we have this. This syntax is definitely slightly funky here, but it's how we do it in FastUI, Fast API. We have form, which is annotated as a login form, but it's also got FastUI form, which also takes login form, all of which looks a bit ugly. But what we're really doing in the background is converting form data into the Pydantic model, including flattening and deflattening the model in the case where we have nested models, which I'll show you in a minute. But the result of this is once we in our post endpoint, we get an instance of the login form that we can then go do stuff with. If I show you a more comprehensive or complex example, this big model here becomes big form, and this has a bunch more stuff in it. So it has file inputs. Now, file inputs are one of the reasons we can't just submit JSON, because they can be very large, and we don't
want encoding and all those things. Yeah,
all those things, right? And so here we have a name. We use bold again, as I have before, to indicate required fields. So we could, I don't know, I've got some Pydantic logos here that I'll use as images. This one is multiple images, so we can select multiple images, a date field, in this case, date of birth.
A calendar picker, very nice. Is that just input type equals?
That's just input type equals date. We have switches. We have, and then you'll see here we have size model, arrow width, and size model, arrow height. And the point is that we're doing here, and these are integer fields, but the cool bit is that they map to a nested Pydantic model within the big model. And so what FastUI is doing internally is basically flattening this into one list of form fields, which is then what we get rendered here.
I see. So in your Pydantic model, you have a size object, but then in the form, it just has the width and then the height, one after another.
Size, width, and size, height. Exactly that.
If I put a requirement or a restriction like min or max onto the field in the size model, will that become a client side min and max in the form?
There's an open PR to do exactly that. Yeah,
awesome.
So that we will do, but obviously we will get server side validation as well.
And then the other thing, for a couple of weeks, so like it's there's more to do, right? But that's awesome. That'll be fun.
Yeah, and then you'll see in uploads we have some quite powerful things we can do here. So we use the upload file, which is a starlet type, but we can also annotate it with form file, which takes two optional arguments of what accept to apply. So that will both in the browser when you open the
when you choose the file browse dialog,
it'll tell you what
have
size.
A MIME. So for people listening, you have the MIME type set, not like a extension, but you have image/star, which means image/JPEG, PNG, WebP, etc. Right.
Right, and that's understood by the browser, and then by the OS to let you select files. But it's also validated server side. So if someone goes and edits their HTML and submits a not image, the server side validation will check, at least based on the file extension, that it looks like an image, and you get back the bytes. So you could also go do validation that the bytes are a valid image if you so wanted.
Could read the BOM, the mark that indicates the file type that's sometimes in these different files. Yeah. Right.
And so if I submit this, but let's say, well, first of all, if I try and submit this because we've got server-side validation of which fields are required, it won't let me submit if this field is not completed. And then I think if we put in name and we don't capitalize it in this case, we'll go off and do the validation and come back and we'll say name will start with a capital because I've implemented it.
Where's that validation? Oh, I see. That's a function that you write.
Right. So just to prove the point, I've just written a validator in Pydantic, which says this must start with uppercase. And if I then went in here and edited that to print out the form, is that going to now clear my form? No, it's not, which is magic. And if I submit that, you'll see here where I printed out the form. We got the different file objects and we got the raw data all come through as the Pydantic model.
Yeah, that's really cool. And so I love how even the custom validators in Pydantic, like Python code that you wrote, appears on what feels like client side, but is really server side validation run by React, right?
Yeah, exactly that. And so we'll do stuff like length checks and all the things you can do on an input client side as well, but of course they'll also be enforced server side, which obviously if you're building anything that is going to be exposed to the internet, you've got to do.
Yeah, you should never trust what comes into your web app. It's just put it online for 5 minutes and look at the log. It's already trying. Somebody's already after wp-admin.php. You know. Yeah,
exactly that. So yeah, that. And then the last thing I'll show, I know we haven't got very long at all, is authentication, which I've just been working on now. So this is, again, is a simple form. I'm just going to select an email, put in a random password, and I can log in. And in this case, I've logged it. It just says who I am and how many people are logged in. If I come back to this page, it'll show me logged in, and I can do post requests to log out. And what it's doing internally is, and again, this is the kind of thing that would be lots and lots of work to go implement if you're doing it yourself, is it's storing in session storage the auth token, then adding it as a header where we do the fetch from the front end to the back end, so we can effectively store sessions that way.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, the auth tokens coming in as a header item or being set as a header item. Excellent.
Right, exactly.
Cool.
So yeah, I hope that we've done a bit of a whirlwind tour through FastUI and what's there now and what I hope is coming up, and the like slightly philosophy of why I built it. But yeah, I hope that was interesting.
It's super interesting, and it's really early days. I'm looking forward to two things: to see what people go do with it, what widgets and stuff they build. So, you know, can you drop in, like you said, a calendar or something awesome like that? And I'm also looking forward to see what you all internally release in a couple months from it.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks so much for having me and letting me witter on about this random library.
Yeah, of course. Good work. It's certainly creative. Maybe just give people a sense of, you know, as we wrap it up, can they use it now? Should they use it now? Can they contribute? Maybe they're interested. What do you tell that crew?
I'd love people to contribute. Both, I mean, almost most useful is issues saying how you're using it, where it's working, where it's not. There was a bunch of people who've already submitted PRs and continue to do so. And yeah, I think what works pretty rigorously, and it's probably better implemented and tested than lots of like private code. But definitely within internal uses, use it now. And like I say, Pydantic is building things with it now. So look, I mean, I give the open source guarantee that it's relatively safe, which is the guarantee that means nothing. But mostly because at the end, it's just defining how you build your UI and, you know, how you implement your session authentication. It's not having strong opinions about that. So yeah, I think it's the place where people should go and try it and give feedback.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks again for coming on the show. Looking forward to talking to you next week. No, just kidding. Like 2 in a row, I suppose. Looking forward to talking to you in 2024.
Absolutely. Have a good Christmas. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye.